of our Liskeard Unlocked events this year. As I mentioned just now, I'm Rachel Brooks. I'm the current Mayor of Liskeard. So in a moment, I'm going to ask Rachel to give her talk, and that will be accompanied by slides, which will appear on your screen. And then when she's finished, as I say, there will be an opportunity for questions and answers. And if you can put those in the chat box, that's ideal, but otherwise wave at me when the time comes. So just a brief introduction to Rachel, and I know some of you who are more local will know Rachel really well, but we obviously have some people, which is brilliant, who are from further afield. Rachel was one of the trustees of Stuart House from 2014 to 2019, and still has an active interest and responsibility for some of its heritage work and edits the monthly newsletter. She has a long-standing interest in buildings and social history, and did some research on 16th and 17th century domestic interiors. She taught history in Jordan and in Britain, including at Liskeard Comprehensive from 1989 to 2000, when she moved up to Sheffield, returning to Cornwall with her husband in 2013 after retiring. She's mounted several exhibitions in Stuart House, including The Real Man Engine, Stuart House and its next door neighbours, King Doniet, to link with the Weatherspoons opening next door, and the Discovering Liskeards exhibitions in the run-ups to previous Liskeard Unlocked. So 2017 was doors that people had to identify where those were in the town, 2018 was windows, and in 2019 it was gatestones. It hasn't been possible to do that this year, but we look forward to next year's challenge. Great. We've got somebody else. Good, welcome, Linda. Can you hear us? Brilliant. Okay. Well, I'm just about to hand over to Rachel Bennett to do the talk. I was just explaining at the beginning. I see you're already muted, which is great. If anybody, if you can just turn off your video as well for when Rachel's speaking, then that helps with the sound quality, and then we'll ask people to turn on their videos later on. So, Rachel, over to you.
Right, thank you. So if we could have the first slide, Mandy. And I know that not everybody knows Liskeard or Stuart House, so I won't take it for granted. My first sentence says, I expect most of you know Liskeard. Right. So this is Stuart House as it was last year. Most of us will know it. It's a fairly big slate-hung building with a tower in the front and an entrance porch 3 stories high. It's got a wing behind it as well. We'll come back to that slide. Next one, please. So this is a map of where it is. I've got an electronic pointer, but more or less in the middle of the map, there's a sort of triangle, and then, yes, it's where the pointer is. So that's Stuart House now. This is the old edition of the Heritage Trail. There's a new edition out now. But you'll see it's on the main road called Barras Street. There's now, Mandy, if you could just run down Dean Street and Bay Tree Hill. That was an important route way through and still is. And what is now Windsor Place, if you could mark that, is a later addition. It wasn't there when Stuart House was first built. Stuart House looked across the town towards the church, which is right on the right-hand side of the map. It's number 7. Yep. And what was the castle, which is up at number 9, up the top right hand, up there. And there's, if you don't know Liskeard, there's a valley in between. The land goes down and back up again to it. So that's where it is. So if we could come back to the house, please, Mandy. Thank you. So what I plan to do is to look a bit at the story of the house over the past 500 years or so, the building itself and the people who lived there. I was going to be selective. I hope not to get too bogged down in lists of names and dates, although I'll take a chronological approach. I don't pretend to be an expert. I owe a great deal to the painstaking work of Tony Wood, one of the original movers of the 1980s and 90s, when the house was on its way to its present incarnation as an Arts and Heritage Centre. Also to the Cornish historian Joanna Mattingly. She and Tony worked a lot together. And I would thank Brian Oldham and others like Jackie at the Old Cornwall Society too for some of the photographs. So to begin with the present. Stuart House is now Liskeard's Art and Heritage Centre with a lovely secret garden. It's behind the building as you look at this picture. It's usually open to everyone for free throughout the year. It's a 3-storey building. It's got 3 permanent displays in 3 rooms on the top floor. There's one about the local area in the Civil War. There's one about the birth of a baby in the house during the Civil War in 1645. And the third one is about the work of the architect and borough surveyor, Henry Rice, who in the mid-19th century was responsible for much building in Liskeard. Also on the top floor is the studio of our artist in residence. And in the Trecarrel room is the base for the Liskeard branch of the Old Cornwall Society. Now the first floor, middle floor, has a gallery that's on the left-hand side of the tower as you look at it, and a smaller room on the right-hand side, both hireable for exhibitions, concerts and other events. There is the room where King Charles I is likely to have stayed during his 1644 visit and some office space. The ground floor, entered through the arched porch, has a through passage from front to back, with the original reception hall on one side, that's the left-hand side as you look at this, and a room mysteriously called the surgery, which I'll explain later, on the other side, and a cafe at the back. Under the stairs, there's a slate shelved storage area with a 17th century window and the entrance to the secret passage, now blocked off, which seems to have run down to the pipe well in the centre of town. There are stories of early 20th century housemaids using it to meet up with their boyfriends at the pipe well. Next one, please. Thank you. Right, so nowadays, people can walk along the street without being particularly aware of the house. The library on one side, that's the far side as we look at it, is a much more imposing building. Good. And the new Weatherspoons building on the other side, the King Doniot it's called, focuses attention. And both of these are built on what was once the garden, yards and outbuildings of Stuart House. The house as it is now, with its footfall of perhaps 10,000 visits in a more typical year, would in many ways be recognisable to those who knew it at its beginning, over 500 years ago, probably a little before 1500. But of course, so much has changed with the house itself, with the streetscape around it, and with the town in which it lies. Next one, please. So as it says, this is an artist's impression of the house from the east, that's what's now the garden side, before the 17th century developments. 4 large granite window frames still exist below the slates and render the other windows a supposition. But we've got no documentary evidence about exactly when or by who the house was built, which has given rise to some speculation. Suggestions have included someone linked with the church or a steward of the castle, although the castle was already a building in some decay by 1500. But the most likely name seems to be John Tregasau, who was a rich landowner and merchant of Liskeard. Now, Liskeard was already a significant town in about 1500. It had been mentioned in the Domesday Book. It had got a series of royal charters from 1240, permitting a regular market and 2 fairs a year. It was also a coinage or assaying town. Next, please. Thank you. Right, so this is a plan of the house today. And the red bit is the early original part. So the house would have been an imposing one on a half-acre plot. As I say, the original part of the building is in red. It had a cross passage, labelled the cross passage, running east to west. Just look at the orientation compass up the top. North is to the left. So what's now the garden is on the east side. So it had a cross passage running east to west with granite arches in a style typical of late medieval date, originally at each end. This cross passage separated the hall on the left, called the parlour on this plan, which had a large fireplace on its east side. You can see the indentation with a dotted line across it. And big stone mullioned windows in the same wall. And on the other side of the cross passage, which is now called the surgery, the cellar, they were originally service rooms, including a kitchen with a fireplace on the east wall of the kitchen. So if you look at where it says the surgery and go up, yes, so that's the fireplace up in there, up in the top right-hand corner. So there would have been two big chimneys. Next slide, please. We're coming back to this one. So again, from the east side of the house, you see those two big chimneys. The one on the left being the kitchen chimney, the one on the right being the hall chimney. There's also likely to have been a newel or spiral staircase leading up to two more stories on the south side. And there was another story, or probably two, as this drawing shows, on the north side above the hall. What's interesting is that when the house was built, and for the first century or so of its life, the front of the house fronted eastwards, looking across to the church and the site of the castle. It had a back door. Next slide, please. Right, so this is now, as we might know, the inside porch door, but it was originally the back door of the house. The granite arch on the west or road side of the cross passage, which went onto the King's Highway, near where there was probably a bar, hence Bar, Barrel, or now Barras Street. But the front entrance to the house was at the other end of the passage, where there's a more modern door with stained glass around it on this. But there was an arch there, and that's now the garden side, and the entrance to the whole property was what is now on what is now Bay Tree Hill, which was then a continuation of Dean Street leading down to Fore Street, which Mandy showed on the map. Next, please. So back to the plan again. Now, about 100 years after it was originally built, so that's the early 17th century, the house took on the orientation and form which we know today. The Jane family became owners of the house before 1627. Before then, we know little about its ownership. They were a wealthy family with land and property around Liskeard, and they were lawyers. The most important figure in terms of the house's history was Joseph Jane, the town's mayor, as his father had been, and a member of Parliament. There were 44 members of Parliament in Cornwall at this stage, but he was one of them. Joseph's first wife had died with their child soon after its birth, and his second wife was Loveday Kekovich of Catchfrench near Liskeard, and they were to have 6 children. Joseph Jane was an ardent royalist during the English Civil War, which broke out in 1642. He seems to have been an ambitious man and keen to show his status, and he made major alterations to the house, notably turning it so that the entrance front was now on the west side, onto the King's Highway as it is today. The original arch from the eastern end of the cross passage was moved out beyond the original western arch to create a porch. And above this was, and still is, the tower extending the full height of the building. On the top floor of the tower, which we now call the lookout, there are 2 little square single light windows giving views up and down the road. Now, the other major alteration that Joseph Jane made was building a 3-storey east wing out from what had now become the back of the house. That's the bit that's labelled the kitchen and the servery on this modern plan. It had 2 rooms on each floor, each with fireplaces. The original fireplace on the east wall of the old service kitchen, which Mandy pointed out before, was blocked up. The presence now of cupboards and an alcove in that wall, now an inside wall, suggests that. New fireplaces were cut on the south wall. Next one, please. So from the garden to the east side, you can see the extension clearly. You can see that it's not sort of jointed in at the corner to the original building. You can see still the single hall chimney, but the other one is now lost inside the new building, although there are chimneys on the gable end of the new extension. If you just look at the new extension, the middle floor of it, what's now the window with 3 lights in it, up on the extension coming out. Come left, Mandy. Yeah, that one. Yes. Now that's the window of the king's room that the king is said to have stayed in. It also seems likely that Joseph Jane added a staircase on the site of the present one, and the panelling in the hall also dates from this time. This was a family house, but also one for entertaining all important people. Joseph Jane's younger son, William, was born here in 1645. That baby went on to become a professor of divinity at Oxford University, and like all Joseph Jane's children, died childless. Next, please. So, in 1644, during the civil war between the Royalists and the Parliamentarian forces, King Charles I stayed at Mr. Jane's house in Liskeard. The story of the civil war in Cornwall is complicated, but at the time of his visit, the Royalists were threatened but winning. In August, the king spent 5 nights in the house on his way west with 10,000 troops, who surrounded the Parliamentarian Earl of Essex near Lostwithiel. Charles spent another night at the house on his way back east. After the victory, he was actually nearly shot by a sniper, apparently, but won the battle. It was the biggest defeat for parliamentarians for the whole of the Civil War. He's thought to have slept in what has, for at least 150 years, been called the King's Room on the first floor of the new East Wing. The King's visit has inspired quite a few writers and artists. This picture by Jane Stanley is part of a series in the Liskeard Museum, and she was very pleased that I should use it. It may not be quite accurate in terms of the floors on the north and the windows on the south, and one wonders whether there would have been more privacy and security for the garden and access to the back of the house. Some of our visitors have to be disabused of the idea that the king escaped down the secret passage. He'd got no need to. His host in the town was loyal to him. However, his victory was, as we know, not to last. Joseph Jane was down at Pendennis Castle by 1646, holding out for the Royalists, but 2 years later he went abroad to join in service to the exiled Charles, Prince of Wales, later Charles II. Joseph Jane died 10 years later without returning to Liskeard, where some of his property had been seized, and more, including the house, bought by John Trethewey, who'd also been a Royalist, but maybe a less active one. Maybe because of this, when Loveday Jane returned with her daughters to Liskeard at the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, she was able to take possession of her old house again. By this time, there seems from a sale document of 1653 also to have been another building on the same plot, to the south of the original house. We don't know exactly when this was built or what it was like. Loveday Jane did not long survive her return and was buried in Liskeard. The house passed to her daughter, Thomasine Baron of Treloddock. Her will of 1707 left it to her cousin, James Buteel, but he lived at Fleet in Devon and let the house to the Dennis family. This was the beginning of a very complicated history of changing ownerships and tenancies, further confused by the house being split into two residences at times. Edward and George Dennis both served more than once as mayors of Liskeard and seem to have used the house as their townhouse whilst keeping up their estate, which was near Dulo. Next one, please. It seems likely that the very fine staircase still in the house was added by the Dennises in about 1740, so we're now about 100 years after King Charles's visit. Liskeard was then a significant town, its wealth largely from agricultural trades and woolen yarn, with 200 or so houses in the town. It still returned 2 members to Parliament. Daniel Defoe, writing in the early 18th century, said that it was better built than Saltash, housed people of fashion, and had a good trade in leatherware. In 1752, John Wesley said it was one of the pleasantest towns in Cornwall. The first turnpike road was in 1760, although it wasn't until the 1790s that by an Act of Parliament, the Torpoint Ferry developed, and Liskeard became even more important as a coaching town. Meanwhile, in the second half of the 18th century, the house, probably as 2 residences, seemed to have lost something of its association with the landed gentry and civic dignitaries, and there was a cordwainer or shoemaker living in some of it, maybe by inheritance. A deed of 1782 speaks of a mansion or dwelling house, together with a stable, malt house and pump, and also all that garden, orchard and backside where the pump is. However, there was major refurbishment during this period. Next one, please, Mandy. So new fashionable sash windows were added. This is the sash window at the southern end of the gallery, looking out onto the garden. You can see the thickness of the original walls here, and you can also see that there's been some subsidence, probably because of the granite arch, more or less underneath it, being removed to the other end of the cross passage. It's perfectly safe, but there are some gloriously wonky angles in Stuart House. So, fashionable sash windows. New flooring was put into the east wing, where rooms were subdivided to create corridors with smaller rooms leading off. Buildings against the south wall, which is where Weatherspoons is now, but buildings against that south wall, a double-gabled extension may have been added then. It may have been that a 3rd floor was built, or more likely rebuilt, on the north side of the cross passage. As was to show in restoration work almost 200 years later, this had half-timbered walls with stone infilling about 4 inches thick, in contrast with the stone walls below, which are about 2 feet thick. It also seems possible that the slate hanging, such a feature of the house now, was added at this time, giving a continuous finish to the street front and concealing building lines. Next one, please. So much of this work may have been done by John Sowden, a carpenter, who raised a mortgage for £350 to buy part of the house in 1792. Now, maybe he was speculating and hoped to make a great profit by selling a residence so thoroughly refurbished that it was actually described 2 years after he bought it as new built. But any such hope seemed to have been in vain, and he was clearly in financial difficulties. Despite raising more mortgages, he sold out in 1815, and that included a great deal of furniture. Next one, please. I don't expect you to be able to read this, but this is the inventory of the furniture, and it has been transcribed, and when you can go into the house, it's displayed in one of the rooms. It's got details of the furnishing in the kitchen, parlour, back kitchen, pantry, chamber over the parlour, chamber over the kitchen, room behind the chamber over the kitchen, room over the kitchen chamber, and room over the parlour chamber. There was a clock and case on the stairs, and a cherry wood dining table with 6 chairs and a tea table in the parlour, together with glass and silverware and 6 blue-edged teacups and saucers. 5 bedsteads with bedding, including a 4-poster, are also listed in their rooms, amongst everything else. The carpenter, John Sowden, sold to John Penrose, James Penrose, whose widow and daughter sold it to John Carthew. It changes hands an awful lot, but sold it to John Carthew for £340 in 1829. John's brother, Edmund Carthew, had already bought part of the house for £700 in 1799, so the property was again united into a single dwelling, with the Carthew brothers listed as living in the house together in 1830. Going back to the pattern of past residents, they also served as mayors of Liskeard. In the 1841 census, the first modern style one, Edmund's son John and daughter Susan were listed as living in the house with their 75-year-old Uncle John. Next, please. So this is the 1848 Tithe Map, and it shows Stuart House and its plot clearly. So Stuart House is here, yes, on what was then called Barrel Street. You can see the big size of the corner plot. I'm sorry. You can see the big size of the corner plot. I took the telephone away, but the pad obviously rings. You can see that Windsor Place isn't. It did go straight down from Barrow Street down to meet Lemelian Street, so that's not there. So Stuart House is on this big corner plot. And this map is 1848. 5 years earlier, John Carthew Jr. had arranged that his sister Susan should have the house. The rather moving document says, "In consideration of the natural love and affection which he hath and beareth towards the said Susan Carthew, his sister, he gave the dwelling house, with the garden, stables, outhouses, and premises thereto adjoining, and the houses, outhouses, edifices, buildings, cellars, areas, courts, courtyards, gardens, warehouses, pumps, cisterns, sewers, gutters, drains, ways, paths, passages, lights, waters, watercourses, liberties, privileges, easements, profits, commodities, advantages, and emoluments whatsoever, to her and her assignees, to have and to hold from the next day for 60 years, in consideration of 10 shillings sterling to be paid to John, and every year rent of a peppercorn, if the same shall be lawfully demanded." Next one, please. It's very recognisable as Stuart House. And this was, yes, drawn 1874, the date's down the bottom left, by the Reverend Lakes of St Martin's Church. So Susan Carthew lives here for about 40 years until her death in 1876, aged 84, when the obituary in the Cornish Times records, "By the death of this lady, the town loses one from the ranks of its most charitable. Miss Carthew's kindness of heart and readiness to relieve, without distinction, the necessities were well known. Not to Liskeard only was her benevolence confined, but she was also a large subscriber to charitable institutions elsewhere." We've got no picture of Susan Carthew, but she was clearly a notable person in Liskeard. Her 40 or so years in Stuart House, as it was by then known, saw huge changes in Liskeard. The population rose to some 6,500 by 1861. She would have been living in the house during the copper mining boom. Copper had been struck on Carradon Hill in 1836. She must have known Henry Rice, Liskeard's Inspector of Nuisances and Borough Surveyor, and of his concern with the dreadful living conditions in the miners' and other workers' courts in the town. Moon's Court, for example, was just across the road from Stuart House. Rice was the architect of so many buildings, big and small, in the town, over 100 of which are still standing. Rice also cut through Windsor Place in 1863 to create a straight route through to the new 1859 train station. and its work on that would have been clearly visible and heard from the street side windows of Stuart House. Next, please. Census evidence from, well, 1841 one is here, but also the 1851, 61 and 71. It indicates that Susan Carthew, listed as fundholder, proprietor of houses and land, seems to have lived in the house with several female live-in servants. There's been some speculation, knowing her kindness, about just why there were so many, including several from the Kelly family, who'd maybe fallen on hard times. There's a question about who Susan E Avery was. She was listed as a visitor, aged 4, in 1851, the niece to Elizabeth Avery, a house servant. 10 years later, she's still in residence, listed as the daughter of a farmer. After another 10 years, she's still there, listed as a companion. Maybe she was an orphan, maybe she was an illegitimate child, it might be possible to find out. Her aunt, Elizabeth Avery, listed in the house in the 1841 and the 1851 censuses, had been a servant in Stuart House for 24 years when she died an awfully sudden death in 1858. Her death was detailed in the Cornish Times. She went to church and then called on her friend Ellen Short, who'd been a fellow servant at Stuart House before she married and moved to Castle Cottages. Within about a quarter of an hour, Elizabeth complained of lack of breath and stomach pains, collapsed on a sofa, drank a little brandy and died. Elizabeth Ann Kelly, yet another servant at Stuart House, said she'd seemed in ordinary health when she left for church. Next, please. So, the house again. Susan Carthew seems to have lived here comfortably, whilst caring for the welfare of others. The important sale of household furniture, etc., on the 12th and 13th of July 1876, notified in the Cornish Times after her death, says, "The contents of Stuart House, being of high repute, further content here is deemed unnecessary." The rooms in the house are listed and suggest that the rooms were more subdivided than they are today, even accounting for the extension on the south side already mentioned. Listed: a dining room, drawing room, sitting room, little sitting room, green room, dressing room, king's room, best bedroom, small bedroom, south bedroom and passage, servant's bedroom, lobby and staircase, servant's sitting room, kitchen, pantry, larder, scullery, wash house and laundry, yard and outhouse, greenhouse and gardens. Notice the reference to the king's room. It also seems likely that it was during this time when Susan Carthew was in residence that the slate sign high up on the north side of the tower was put up, saying that King Charles I lodged here with the dates. Susan Carthew's niece Emily, who had been born in Canada and was living with her aunt in Stuart House in 1861, then aged 28, seems to have inherited it briefly, and later in 1876 her widower, a surgeon, sold it for £1,300. Alfred Clifton, an architect possibly working with Richard Code on the restoration work at St Martin's Church, lived in the house for 3 years, paying £56 a year rent. Next, please. So the house, again, it's labelled clearly, now with a single-storey room on the east or garden side, which you can see sticking up at the top of the building, up that one, that wing. Yes, that's an extension. The original east wing is the one below, and then down on the south side, above where it says Stewart of Stuart House, is the doubled gabled extension. So this house now with a single story room on the garden side, which is shown on this, which is the 1882 Ordnance Survey map, then remained linked with other medical men. And it's because of this that the room now called the surgery on the ground floor gets its name. It suggested that there was a waiting room in the double gabled extension still on the southern side. J.T. Cheeves of Millbrook, surgeon, and Charles Bainbridge Rendell of Devonport, surgeon, who'd married into the Carthew family, ran their medical practice from the house. However, the 1891 census lists the Hammond family as living in the house. William, a surgeon, aged 42, with his wife, 6 daughters and 1 son, together with a governess, a lady's maid, a housemaid and a cook. Next one, please, Mandy. So this is the house on the left, which is probably early 1890s when the Hammonds would have been in it. You can see to the far side of the porch the walled garden with foliage above it. And at the end is what was Trehawk House, demolished 1910 or so. The gardens were used to build a cattle market. So in 1895, Dr. Hammond actually bought the house from the previous medical practitioner for £1,350, most of which he raised as a mortgage. Maybe Dr. Hammond needed still more money, for in the same year he bought Stuart House, he sold some of its garden to the borough of Liskeard for the building of a public library. Next one, Mandy, please. So this is the indenture of 1895, and you can see Barrow Street in orange. You can see Stuart House coloured in heavier red and various outbuildings, and you can see then the bits that's taken out, which says Corporation of Liskeard, site of approved public library. So this indenture says that he sold the land for £330 and that access to light and air through the library windows constructed along the boundary with the Stuart House garden was provided that the lowest points of each window was not less than 6 feet above the floor of the room or passage which it served. So that presumably, unless you were extremely tall or standing on something, you couldn't peer through a library window into Stuart House's garden. It also says that the library building was allowed to entirely obstruct the access of light and air to and through the window in the northern wall of a room in Stuart House now used as a dining room. This probably explains the present alcove in the north wall of the hall, the reception hall, which now contains a mirror. William Hammond also held his surgery in the ground floor, on the ground floor of the house, in the room which still bears that name. And there was a waiting room in the extension beyond this, now demolished, but very evident in the turn of the century photographs, such as the next one, please. So this is the coronation of Edward VII in 1902, wonderful street scene. You can see Stuart House with sort of 1.5 of the double-gabled single-storey extension, showing with plants growing horizontally along trained wires. You can see ivy over some of the house. You can also, if you look carefully, in the bigger window above the double-gabled extension, that window seems to be open and there's a figure in there, which is lovely. And there are 1 or 2 other photographs of this same scene that have somebody looking out the window. That's 1902. It may have been the Hammonds who were responsible for the nice stained glass still in the windows of the ground floor surgery, the hall and the door into the garden, and also for an early 20th century conservatory on the back of the house, and the single story where the single story eastern extension had been taken down. The family was still in the house in 1901 with a parlour maid, lady's maid, cook, and now a nurse rather than a governess. 10 years later, William Hammond, now a widower aged 62, but still listed as a medical practitioner, together with 3 daughters and his son William, now a captain in the Indian Army with a wife and a child both born in India, were still in residence. However, the following year, 1912, Dr. Hammond sold the house to George Gregor Morecambe, merchant of Blamey and Morecambe, agriculture and wool merchants, one of Liskeard's most important businesses. They had a big warehouse very near Stuart House, where the pet shop is now. I'd expected some of the Morecambe family to be, they were booked in for this talk, but they aren't here, I don't think. But His son, George Gregor Morecambe's son, George, took up residence in the house in 1925 when his father moved to Dean Street. This younger George had two brothers, Dennis and Frank. Next picture, please. This is Frank Morecambe. Now, Frank Morecambe left Stuart House as a volunteer and was killed in action on the Western Front in May 1917. It was during the Morecambe's ownership of Stuart House that the secret passage, which had become dangerous, was blocked up. Next one, please. That's all it is now. It's basically a storage cupboard under the stairs with a rather interesting looking sort of slate footing bit, which doesn't go anywhere. But that was blocked up, and it may have been the Morecambe family as well who demolished the double-gabled extension on the south side. In 1937, Stuart House, together with outbuildings, showroom, workshop, garages and other outbuildings and yard and appurtenances, were sold to Leonard Truscott, next slide please, for £5,000, thus beginning almost 50 years of the house being associated with a garage forecourt and associated buildings lying south of the house. Remember that before the Liskeard bypass was built in 1977, Barrow Street was the main road, and there were, understandably, several car showrooms, garages and petrol stations on it. Published recently in Lincoln Horn, The Story of a Cornish Parish, is the memory of Leonard Truscott's great-grandson, who says, Leonard ran the garage in Liskeard and lived in Stuart House next door. As a child, I remember the rear courtyard, the walls of which seemed to rise upwards forever, with rooks cawing around the lofty chimney. You can buy a coffee there now. Of course, the space seems much smaller through adult eyes. From 1951 to 69, the Couch family lived in the house, with the garage continuing as Truscott's. The three Couch children were apparently very sad that the underground passage had been blocked up. There was a playgroup for children run by Mrs. Couch in the house. In 1969, Harold Locke bought the house and garage and moved his tailor's garage business from the site across the road. His family lived in the house until 1985. Next, please. This is a flat which was constructed. This is in its last days, about 2017-18, when it was derelict. But a flat was constructed along the east side of the house, along the eastern side of the house, and it abuts the end of the east wing of Stuart House. The Lockes were the last family to live in the house. Next, please. So in 1988, after 4 years planning, Stuart House was bought by the Stuart House Trust, which had been formed in 1984, for £75,000, and the trust began to restore the house. So you can see with a red around it, the plot which was bought by the trust, and the green hatched areas still belong to tailors, including the bit to the north of the house, which apparently was at one stage going to be part of the sale deal, but in the end wasn't. That's now the garden of Weatherspoons. So £75,000 it cost, and the trust begins restoration. Originally, the intention had been for it to house the town museum, but this was stymied when unexpectedly later in 1984, the town council voted for the museum in the public hall complex. This was before it was later relocated to Foresters Hall. Next one, please. The garage continued on the adjoining site until 2007, with access to the rear garden of Stuart House well in excess of the officially permitted 3 foot wide on foot only, being generously allowed while the 10 years restoration work was in progress. The house was in need of significant repairs as well as restoration, and proceeded in 7 phases between 1988 and 1999. A whole talk or more could be devoted to this, but I'm just going to pick out 1 or 2 points. So next, please. The first phase focused on the south wall, covered in concrete render when the double-gabled wing was demolished. This had cracked, making the wall soaking wet. The wall had also been weakened when chimney flues were inserted in it during Joseph Jane's early 17th century alterations, and when doors were cut through into the double-gabled extension, now demolished. Next one, please. Work began in the garden with the demolition of the conservatory and the breaking up of a large concrete tennis court. You can see, actually, if you look at the eastern extension, middle floor, the window there isn't the same one as we saw earlier for the King's Room. You can see the shaping of it there, but different wall. So anyway, the conservatory and the tennis courts were taken down. Next, please. The second phase saw a new kitchen and toilets installed so that the house could begin to function as a meeting place. And if you look at the bottom picture, you can see the old stone lintel of the original fireplace. And the original fireplace has been cleared back in, although there's still a more modern mantel in there. Next, please. Right, phases 3 and 4 saw the refixing of the slates on the street front, but this exposed the expensive problem of the timber studding on the front of the top story being rotten. So this is all the new work that was put in up there. The gallery was refloored and dividing bedroom walls were removed. When the whole floor was removed, the granite mullions and lintels from the original windows were found supporting the joists, and these are now in the garden. Next, please. Right, the original granite fireplace in the hall was exposed. That's the fireplace in the lower picture that Charles I would have seen, together with the 17th century panelling, which you can't see in this picture. But you can see from the top the residence with some sort of storage heater in there to the fireplace again. Next, please. In phase 5, the King's Room windows were restored and the fireplace uncovered, as shows in the bottom picture, and the splendid pink family bathroom was removed. Next, please. Right, this is up the top of the east wing. False ceilings on the top floor were removed, exposing original roof timbers, which people who are into joints and things are very enthusiastic about. The slate hanging was rehung on the garden side, exposing yet more rotten timbers there too. Phase 6 dealt with the cracks which now appeared in the south wall. Despite the earlier work, the wall began to bulge inwards, and it was revealed that only the outer face of the wall supported the top floor. The inner wall was therefore rebuilt in brick, which meant losing the granite fireplace in the Tudor room on the top floor. Next, please. It looks as if there's a fireplace in there, but it's actually a wooden box with a picture of a fireplace on it. Phase 7 dealt more with the inside of the house and involved hours and hours of volunteer labour, sanding floors and the restoration of the staircase and decoration throughout. High quality reproduction furniture, which we can see here, and textiles were made for the King's bedroom, which was originally in the King's bedroom, but has now been moved to this room called the Tudor room on the top of the house, and it's part of the Birth of the Baby exhibition. This wasn't the end of maintenance work, even after Stuart House was fully open as an arts and heritage centre. The extreme weather of the winter of 2013-14 caused water penetration of the south wall yet again, and the wall bulged again and cracked. Next, please. So some £30,000 had to be found for the 2015 work of pinning the wall, strengthening it with metal ties and inserting lead trays to carry water away. As with all the work, restoring and renovating the house, because it's grade 2 star listed, particular materials have to be used like lime mortar. Access for this work was much easier than it would be today, as the old garage site, which is now occupied by Weatherspoons, was absolutely derelict for 10 years between 2007 and 2017. Last one, please, Mandy. So back to the house again. The objects of the Stuart House Trust are, firstly, to renovate, preserve and maintain for the public benefit the property known as Stuart House in Liskeard. And secondly, to raise the cultural awareness of the public by continuing to develop and promote Stuart House as an arts and heritage centre for South East Cornwall. So that's where the house is today. It is not simply an arts and heritage centre, but is in itself a building reflecting more than 500 years of history. It's got a fascinating story to tell, rooted in political, social and economic history, in place, as Liskeard has changed through the ages, and in people, including Joseph Jane, John Sowden, Susan Carthew, William Hammond, and so many others, which I've tried to share something of today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Rachel. As somebody who's been in Stuart House very many times and, you know, seen the exhibitions in there as well, I can honestly say I've learned an awful lot more about the house today, and that was a really you know, clear and interesting talk. So thank you very much indeed for that. So we've got time for some questions. I've got a question which I'll ask to get us started, and I hope, as I say, that other people will have some questions as well. So, as you say, the house has had many occupants over the years and been used in many ways. Do you have a sort of favourite period in terms of when your interest is most piqued by what was going on in the house?
Well, I mean, I'm interested in the early bit because I've always been interested in Tudor and Stuart history. But in terms of the history of the house, it's when Susan Carthew takes over that I actually feel I can relate to somebody living in it. Yeah.
Right. Yes. Okay. Thank you. Mark has put in the chat, very interesting, Rachel. It goes on my huge list of Cornish things to see. So
jolly good. Right.
I hope some of you who are from a little bit further away may have the opportunity to come and visit in the future. If anybody's got any other questions, either turn on your video and wave at me, or put something in the chat. And Mandy's put in the chat that she worked at Taylor's Garage when some of the works were being done. I didn't realise that.
Oh, right.
Right. Any other questions? Please either put something in the chat or turn on your video and wave at me, and I'll be happy to take your questions.
Say on the list to come to this were a couple of the Morecambe family, and I thought they might ask a little bit about that period. But...
Yes.
The garden, can I ask about the gardens? I mean, because that's been done up as sort of historic gardens to complement the house itself, hasn't it?
Yes, it has. Yeah.
Yes. So are the plants sort of the sorts that would have been grown at that point time, or that sort of thing?
Well, that was the idea when it was first done, and there was a plan made when it was done, but it's actually proved impractical, partly because there have been lots of very generous people who have given donations to it, which haven't been especially Tudor, and partly because of the upkeep of it. We've got 2 garden volunteers at the moment, one who supervises it a lot, but it would have taken a tremendous amount of upkeep. So the idea is that it's got a Tudor feel, but they aren't necessarily all Tudor plants, although some of them are. Yeah.
No, it's a lovely spot, I must say. That sort of fountain with the lion's head on that side wall, and I don't know, it's a lovely atmosphere there.
Yeah, well, that's 17th century style. There was a lot of. It's not a 17th century fountain. It was made by various local people, but it's in the right style for that period.
Oh, thank you. No.
Yeah,
lovely spot.
It is, isn't it? It's a lovely, peaceful place. So hopefully, before long, it'll be able to be open again. Any other?
So. Maybe before Christmas, but.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Okay, well, in that case, I'd like to thank Rachel again for that really fascinating talk. And so if everybody can turn on their videos a minute, it would be just nice for us all to see each other. And I'd also like to thank you for coming along to be part of our event, which is, as I say, the last of our Liskeard Unlocked events this year. It's been great to be able to host events, even though we're doing it in a bit of a different way this year, to have people involved. And I do hope that some of you, if you haven't already done so, will have a look at our website and see some of the other information we've got. Yes, thank you all very much indeed. It's been great to have you with us.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed.
Yeah.
Thank you. Zoom wave.
Thank you, Mandy, Rachel.
Lovely.